Thank you very much for joining 21st Special Dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. My name is Hiromi Murakami of Global Health Innovation Policy Program, facilitating this dialogue series. We have started this dialogue series when we faced a challenge of COVID-19, and now we have broadened our scope to not only include health risks, but also regional crisis and economic security threats, in particular focusing on Japan's challenges. A lot of assumptions has changed as we experienced COVID-19 and war in Ukraine. And quite recently, Japan has made big change to its own stance on security policy. And in response to that various threat we faced, but we haven't had enough time to discuss in details. And so therefore, it is critical that we need to really think about, what those changes would really affect on us and on the region too. So we're very honored to welcome very special guest from Washington, D.C., Dr. Sheila Smith of Council on Foreign Relations. And we're so excited to welcome her, such an expert, and very interested in hearing her views on Japan's challenge, changing threats and policy toward China. And are grateful that Dr. Sheila for sharing her analysis and concerns with us. So let's pass the microphone to Dr. Sheila Smith, and followed by a comment and remarks made by Dr. Narushige Michishita, who is a vice president and professor of GRIPS. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Murakami-san. I'm delighted to be here. When Murakami-san first approached me, I was a little hesitant because I am not a public health expert. But once we understood that this could be a broader conversation about Japan's challenges, I was delighted to join GRIPS and to join this audience. And I'm delighted also to see Professor Michishita again, even if it's only just virtually. There is so much for us to talk about. And I know that this is an international audience as well as a Japanese expert audience. And so you'll forgive me a little bit if I weave back and forth between Japan and the US-Japan alliance as I make my remarks. We have gotten, I sit in Washington, D.C., so you're going to hear some of that echoing through my remarks. And I think it might be useful for me to share with you the debate here as well. But really, I think the COVID pandemic has created an anomaly, not only for Japan, but for all of us in terms of the shutdown of in-person diplomatic activity. And of course, national governments, all national governments, China, Japan, the United States, we all turned inwards to try to cope with this unprecedented challenge to our societies. But the absence of in-person diplomacy, I think we're just beginning to understand the consequences of that. And whether it's the more extreme rhetoric of identifying causes and blame for the virus, as you know, in our country, it was very early on dubbed by the president, no less, as the China virus. And it created a whole sense of public antipathy, I would say, towards China. Japan was more moderate in the way that they discussed the genesis of the pandemic and also the global efforts to work on the pandemic. But nonetheless, I think the fact that our leaders were unable to sit down with each other, that they were no longer focused on managing the geostrategic challenges that we pose to each other, I think has really left us with a whole long list of remedies that we have to think about more carefully as we develop our relationship with China. This is as true for Japan as it is for the United States. In your case, of course, Xi Jinping was due to arrive in Japan in April of 2020. In a state visit that was going to be the culmination of summitry designed to put the Sino-Japanese relationship on a more steady footing and to recognize the strategic challenges that lay ahead and the problems that the two countries were having. Japan also had to deal with a new U.S. administration that came in 1 year into the pandemic, a very different transition than you have seen in our politics and our leadership. In fact, for us sitting in Washington, D.C., it was quite traumatic to watch the unruliness of our transition in January of 2021. So there's a lot happening here that is unusual. It's not the same game or the same politics or diplomacy as usual. And I think it's useful to remind ourselves of that the level of uncertainty, both in national politics and in the politics that we are experiencing globally and regionally, is very different than it was prior to 2020. That's not to say that China wasn't a challenge. Of course it was. The Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, had consolidated his power. I would leave it to others who are China experts to talk more about that. But the reality was we were seeing a very different China on the global stage. But we weren't seeing a China that overtly had a strategy of challenging the existing global order or of challenging our priorities as confrontationally as I think we saw when we looked at 2020 and into 2021. The Hong Kong situation, of course, alarmed Japan. It alarmed, obviously, Taiwan. It alarmed many here in the United States. This was a different China. This is a China that was really willing to go beyond thresholds that it had largely respected in the past. And I think that that is a China that we're still trying to grapple with, the ultimate intentions of today's China. Is it really much different, or were they themselves confronted with a situation in Hong Kong that they did not know how to manage at the time? But I think, you know, coming back to Japan and the United States, Japan looked extraordinarily stable during the pandemic. And I know there was public dissatisfaction with the government response. There was the same depth of fear and consternation about the COVID-19 virus itself. But as we looked at you from a distance, your governance looked incredibly measured and steady and stable. And our politics, of course, felt and seemed, and I think for others outside our country, looked to be quite unstable in a way that you had not seen in the past. I think, you know, coming back to the China piece, however, it is only recently that last November, in fact, that our leaders have managed to sit down in person with Xi Jinping to address the events that have occurred that have created this very deep tension between the United States and China, but also clearly with ripple effects for Japan at the same time. Let me just run through some of the things, obviously, that have happened between 2020 and that November 2022 conversation, the first conversation leaders meetings at the ASEAN summit last fall. The pandemic itself, of course, was traumatizing, both globally and nationally. And I think there was a great deal of loss of legitimacy of governance and governance power and capability, especially in the democracies. And again, we can come back to that in the discussion, but I think the weaknesses of our system of government seem to be on display more uncomfortably, perhaps, than we would have liked. I think the moments where the world comes together, not so much with diplomacy, but with common purpose, were no longer available to us. The two Olympics in Japan and then in China were not moments of great celebration around the globe. We all watched on TV, of course, and I think Japan handled it quite well. But usually you have these larger celebrations and they are diplomatic opportunities. They are larger opportunities for publics to also see that their identities can be, if not, you know, completely in unison, at least shared in this idea of competition and coming together as a world to celebrate sports, right, and competition. You had instead very strained popular politics and lack of empathy, I think, in many ways towards people of other countries who are suffering. I think, again, I don't want to talk about the United States. Japan, of course, this was much, in my distant view, this seemed much less a part of your politics, but nonetheless, there wasn't the kind of moment of being able to celebrate in the way that we've seen in the past. At the national level, I think the polarization that Japan avoided didn't exactly solve the economic challenges that the Japanese people felt. I was a little surprised at the extent to which Japanese did not complain too much about the economic setbacks, but I feel that the government felt the blow, if you will, of popular dissatisfaction pretty keenly. Regionally, I think there is a bit of a bright spot, if you'll allow a bright spot into what seems to be a gloomy list, and that was the Quad. I think one of the great accomplishments of the period that we're talking about, the pandemic era, was the organization of the Quad and the energizing of a new diplomatic framework that included Japan, the United States, Australia, and India, and an emphasis on regional coalition building, the idea that the Indo-Pacific needed the kinds of capabilities, first and foremost, a COVID vaccine, but also including other needs such as infrastructure building, energy, other kinds of positive collaboration that the Quad could offer. That's the only bright spot I could find in my list, to be honest with you. If you fast forward into, of course, last year, then we get a much more alarming and profoundly unsettling Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think the Japanese public has experienced this in the same way I think the American public did, in the sense that we are not Europeans. The war was not on our boundary, on our territory, or approaching our boundaries, but nonetheless, it was a war that we thought had been eliminated, right? A land invasion in Europe was something that we thought we would never see. My generation, at least, felt that we would never see this again. Naive as that may sound in hindsight, it was certainly a shock, I think, to how quickly the major power competition that we'd all been talking about in terms of the new world that we were all trying to grapple with, that major power competition, in fact, could lead to the use of military force and aggression on the scale that we see in Ukraine. Out of this comes one of the aspects, I think, that has changed our relationship with China, your relationship with China, and that is this question of just how much Russia and China today have in common, and how much they really do feel that they are going to be able to take on the international order that we built over the last 70 years. Lots of people look at the Olympics meeting in 2022 and this idea that there was this new agreement for a no limits partnership. I think in that statement was something else that I thought was distressing to me. And that was the idea that the global order was no longer the order that they would be respecting, that they very clearly indicated that they wanted to rewrite the rules of the game, if you will, in that statement. So I think we are seeing, in ways that we had imagined, suspected prior to that, we were seeing the overt statement that this was a partnership that was really going to be focused on rewriting international rules. And of course, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in hindsight, that became much, much more alarming. The question of whether or not the use of force would become much, much more prevalent, or a much more legitimate instrument for changing the international order, is really one of the larger academic questions, but also policy questions that we see today. Japan, of course, has felt the brunt of this directly in and around Japanese territory. The Chinese and Russians today operate and exercise in ways designed, I believe, to deliver a message to Tokyo. And Japan and Russian relations, of course, have deteriorated as a result of Japan's decision to support the G7 sanctions. So I think it creates a complication for Japan. It is not the same level of existential challenge that China poses, but nonetheless, it complicates Japanese defenses, as well as the longer-term Japanese strategic view. Japan, I think, from a distance, and this is a positive piece. It's not directly related to China, but it is to the Russian-China relationship. I think Japan's decision very quickly to assert its support for the G7, to sanction Russia in a way that it did not in 2014, I think was very well received among other G7 countries. But I think it was also something that I didn't quite expect from Prime Minister Kishida's cabinet. I thought that it would be more cautious, but the Prime Minister himself framed the G7 response and Japan's response in terms of this idea that Japan would act assertively and in concert with others to sustain the international order. And I think that was a very smart move. But I think the other piece of the puzzle that was surprising to me was to see how much of the Japanese public supported this rather forthright Japanese position on Russian aggression against Ukraine. So public opinion polling was overwhelmingly in favor of the Prime Minister. The Kante was directing the Ministry of Defense and other ministries of government to move expeditiously, not only to sanction Russia, but also to support Ukraine. In other words, it's not just that policy itself, but the demonstration effect of the G7 response and Japan's quick response to Russia, I think was a very strong signal to Beijing about Japan's willingness to stand up to behavior that that violated its view of the rules-based order. We talk a lot in Washington, as you might know, about December 16th and your 3 strategic documents. Again, another accomplishment of the Kishida cabinet. Professor Michishita and I were talking before we went on air about how it's so positively viewed in Washington. It's hard to find criticism, honestly, or any kind of sense that this may be a problematic turn for Japan. I think you saw for the first time our Secretary of State, our Secretary of Defense, our Congress, the White House, all issued statements applauding Prime Minister Kishida and the outcome of the new national security strategy and the 10-year defense plan. We can talk in detail more about that because I think over the long term, I can see some challenges ahead, not just for Japan, but for the alliance as well. But I think those two things in coupled, the assertive G7 response and coalition, the integration of Japan into what we could have thought of as largely a European conflict, I think was a very surprising but welcome policy. I think the Japanese public's response to it has also been striking, as has the Japanese fairly muted response to the ambitious military investment that is signaled by your strategic documents in December. But those two endpoints, if you will, I think have led many of us in the United States and elsewhere in Europe as well to see Japan a little bit differently. And I think Prime Minister Kishida deserves credit, but I think there was a little bit of a sense that Prime Minister Abe was the architect of Japanese statecraft, that Prime Minister Abe in his 8 years in office had largely been the activist prime minister, the strategic prime minister. And I think there was perhaps an underestimation of how deeply the idea that Japan needed to be an activist, an active, engaged leader on the international stage had penetrated not just one prime minister, but his successors and the government that would serve those successors over time. Let me finish on a couple of notes that I think about the challenges that China poses. And these are shared challenges, although they manifest themselves differently for Japan than they do for the United States. Japan, I think we have a strategic challenge. Obviously, the United States is our national defense strategy clearly identifies China as the defining pacing, as our Pentagon uses the terminology, pacing challenge, strategic challenge of the United States going forward. In the last 2+2 meeting that we held just a few weeks ago, it was interesting to hear your foreign minister also talk about Japan's sense of strategic competition with China. China is, I think, recognized by the Japanese government as well as the Japanese people, but largely the Japanese policymakers as a revisionist power. It is not the power that was the next door neighbor and long-term, maybe if not friend, at least compatriot of the Japanese in Asia. Today, the partnership, I think, with Russia has painted a very different picture of China in the minds of your policy community as well. And for Japan today, I think the military investment that you're making, that Shida-san and his cabinet have laid out, portends a very different Japanese response to the way in which the Chinese behave in the region. Now, there are some analysts who would say it's about time. Japan should have been doing this a decade ago. I see it slightly differently, and I see it largely as a decision by the Japanese foreign policy elite to use the military instrument in ways that it has not been comfortable using it in the past. But it also portends a larger challenge, I think, for Japan, and that is Japan alone will not be able to rebalance or take on China. And so this really means that part of the impetus is to ensure that the alliance has the aggregate capability and that Japan has the sufficient kinds of capability required in case there is actually a conflict with China. And this is, for me, as somebody like myself who's watched Japanese defense policy for some time, the alliance in Japan's strategy used to largely be about signaling and deterrence, not about warfighting. And we have made that shift, I think, over the last decade as China's military expansion has grown and as China has itself used the military instrument to coerce its neighbors. I'm not suggesting here that Japan is ready to use the military instrument as an instrument of coercion, but I simply mean that the hesitancy over the military instrument has now, I think, been put aside, and that military capability and military power is now, along with economic and diplomatic strength, being integrated into the national strategy. Now, we will have a challenge in Japan, first and foremost, because of its proximity to Taiwan. This debate over Taiwan, I will confess, and this is just my own personal vantage point here to locate me in the larger debate here in Washington. I'm a little concerned with how myopic policymakers have become on Taiwan and on a Taiwan contingency specifically. That's not to say I don't think we should take it seriously. We should. But I think we have to take a little bit of a step back here and understand that overemphasizing the contingency may in fact lead us to not put as much effort as we need to put into a comprehensive strategy, both economic, military, and diplomatic approach to reducing tensions across the Taiwan Straits. Now, much of the obligation of reducing tensions, of course, belongs in Beijing. And we should be ready, should there be any signals that China is willing to use force. And I think the interactions that we saw last August are something that we should take very seriously as we think about what kind of comprehensive approach is required. In the United States, of course, you know that we have this debate between strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity among our foreign policy experts, not our government. And that's a really important distinction to make. There's a lot of chatter about this, but there is not a debate within our government over what the United States policy actually is, despite some misstatements by our president occasionally. But those who advocate for strategic clarity are saying it's time for us to make an overt commitment to the defense of Taiwan. And you have in your politics, in your body politics, Japanese politicians who would like us also to take the position that we will commit to the defense of Taiwan. That is, in my judgment, would be a mistake, and it is unlikely to happen, at least in the near term. And the reason for that is twofold. One is our policy of strategic ambiguity is not simply a military policy. It also pertains to how our policy has evolved vis-a-vis Taiwan, in addition to how it's evolved vis-a-vis Beijing. And this is where Japan has always had this policy. But sometimes in Tokyo, I find people misunderstand that our policy also is not in favor of Taiwan independence. In fact, President George Bush very clearly made that point, that we do not support Taiwanese independence. And the United States would not support a Taiwanese government that advocated for independence. So strategic ambiguity is not a military policy alone. It is a balancing act between making sure that Taiwan is adequately defended, but also not tipping the balance, tipping the scale, rather, one way or the other. And what I worry about when I watch some of the political debate in Tokyo, I worry a little bit about, again, this overemphasis on the military piece and underemphasis on what types of levers, what types of positions, what types of diplomacy we have in the past and today continue to have vis-a-vis Taiwan. So let me leave that piece aside. There is a question of Taiwan's own agency that we often also sideline here when we think about Japan's relationship with China and our relationship with China. There is an election coming in Taipei. Our politics have also, United States politics, have also made the Taiwan issue somewhat brittle. And I think the Speaker Pelosi's visit last August revealed a dynamic that would be very easy for Japan to become nervous about the American conduct of its relationship with China and its relationship with Taiwan. There are real consequences for Japan in the way that the United States conducts its diplomacy. And when we have conversations with policymakers in the government, many of us make that point, that it's not just a policy that will affect the United States. Our ability to manage the cross-straits relationship will also have deep implications for the future security of Japan. So again, we have a lot of work to do in the alliance. Professor Michishita and I can talk more about that in the discussion. But let me end here with my sense is that both in Tokyo and in Washington, our policymakers have to take care not to invite, right, the behavior of China that we're trying to deter. And that's where politics in a democracy become difficult to manage. I think our politics last summer spilled over in a direction that was not stabilizing. The positive outcome, if there is a positive outcome to be had, was that we now have a direct dialogue between the President of the United States and Xi Jinping, and with Xi Jinping and the Prime Minister of Japan, hopefully. And this is where the work is ahead of us, is to find the diplomatic path with Beijing to ensure that the spillover of politics, the agency of actors outside the state, does not overwhelm the ability of the governments to manage the strategic competition that we are going to be living with for generations, I believe. So with that, let me stop here. Thank you, Murakami-san.
Thank you very much. Very, very stimulative a topic that you covered. So maybe Dr. Michishita, would you like to have a remarks?
Right.
Later?
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Yeah, I'm always impressed by the kind of nuance that you present in your talk. So it's a really rich and comprehensive and nuanced remarks that you have made. Thank you so much. I have three sort of straightforward questions. One is, what are the two most, Japan has just revised its security policy significantly, but what are the two most important and positive elements in the Japan's new security policy as the American policymakers or specialists like you see it? Well, in Japan, people focus on some of the specific issues such as acquisition of strike capabilities and other things. But what are the, I think perspective from the US is certainly different from the ones in Japan. So that's my first question. And the second one is, so you said, overwhelmingly, specialist policymakers in the US welcome what Japan is doing. So that's a great news. But if everything is so good, that makes me a little worried and concerned. And so I would like to ask about I would say, two most important concerns that the specialists in the US have about Japan's new security policy. And finally, so we are in a good shape. We are doing a good job, and we are strengthening our relationship. But more specifically, what would be the two most important policy agendas that the two countries should be talking about together or with each other going forward? So those are the questions that I have. Thanks.
Great. Well, there's a lot. I mean, I one or two I can, on the first two questions, I can keep myself to one or two, but our agenda in the last one is so comprehensive in so many ways, it's so broad. But let's talk a little bit about the positive elements. And again, I am a Japan watcher, so my assessment may not reflect my government's assessment, obviously, nor the broader kind of excitement that there has been in media and policy circles and in the policy wonky circles, as we call them in DC. But to me, the one piece of the puzzle that I thought was very positive and very constructive, if I can use that word, was that this was largely initiated by Japan. That this was Prime Minister Kishida's initiative to have an overarching strategic review. I watched that process with great fascination, but it was fun to watch it as something that was homegrown, if you will, that was coming out of a Japanese political process, was coming out obviously of the party, and then there was the national policy debate within the government, and then there was the larger debate in the public sphere that we could all read. This old model of Gaiatsu, or Washington wants Japan to do this, that model, I think, is old and it's not useful. And I think it hinders the alliance rather than strengthens it. And so I was delighted to see that process. Again, the Japanese people at the end of the day will support their government or not. And so that was to watch that at two levels of both policy review and Japanese public assessment of that review, I thought was really quite fascinating and constructive. The other is, and I say this first about the National Security Strategy document itself, which, to be honest with you, I had to read multiple times before I could think about what I thought about it, because I was trying to read between the lines. But in fact, you don't need to read between the lines. It was a pretty comprehensive whole of government type of assessment of Japanese national goals and national power. And I thought that was an interesting statement as well. I thought it was, lots of people make a lot of the threat analysis that drives it, but I think if you get beyond that media headline, it was actually quite comprehensive in thinking about Japanese national power over the long run and whether it was sufficient or how it could be made to be sufficient to deal with the level of uncertainty that Japan is presented with. So that, in the end, I thought was very interesting to me. The 10-year defense plan, I'm going to use the word comprehensive again, but I think what was, I was happy to see were both the kind of integrated thinking about indigenization of technological capability. So how much was going to be invested in Japan's own capability to develop technologies that it would need, but also the kinds of things that often get left off because they're not as sexy, if I can put it that way. The resilience issues, right? The sustainability of operations of the SDF in a crisis or worst case scenario in a conflict in a defense operation. And I think, again, that this counterstrike, of course, we have been talking about as in the expert community, as you know, for quite some years now about is this the right answer, right? Or, how do we think about this? Is it possible? What kind of strike? So all that kind of conversation has been batting around among the experts, but, and it was in the headlines. And I think it's a huge change, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I think the larger picture of it's not just this area and that area, it is the entire integrative process of thinking how to make our military able to defend Japan, from the permanent operational command to the resilience, the fuel and the ammo and the bunkers, to the training of a new cyber command. I mean, it really, that's another place where our experts in Washington are still trying to digest the range of topics that were covered in that plan. So I think those are the things, both that it was Japan initiated and homegrown in terms of the thinking, and it was comprehensive at both levels of strategy and defense preparation, I think were really interesting for me. The challenges that I see, there are two. They're already out and about in your politics, of course, and that's the fiscal situation. I mean, can you afford it? It's a huge undertaking, right? And I'm not saying that if you take it lightheartedly. You know, when your LDP presidential election of 2021 raised this question of 2% of GDP, I thought that was a bit of a throwaway line, honestly. I didn't think that was going to end up being national policy, that maybe it was going to be LDP ambition, but not national policy. So watching that emerge from, you know, a certain sector of the LDP experts group to then to be the platform of the party and then to become national policy for me was really fascinating. But it's a real question, and it's a question for all our democracies, frankly, right? Our Congress is surprisingly, the Republicans now want to cut our defense budget in the new Congress. So this is the stuff of democratic politics, and Germany is confronting it as well. But this question of a defense tax versus debt versus, right, we're all going to watch that very, very carefully. And I think it's a challenge because having advertised the goal, not reaching it would also be not good for Japan, you know, and I'm not saying 2% is the right number. I'm just simply saying the policy goal has been stated with certainty and not being able to reach it, I think would be not to Japan's advantage, honestly. The second is the obvious place, and that is for the coming from Washington, the use of force question. You know, once the capability of strike is ascertained and acquired, and of course, you know, this has to go through missile proliferation scrutiny and all kinds of things yet, if it's the Tomahawk option. But the acquisition of strike capability that can reach deep into continental Asia will require the United States and Japan to think about how and when that strike gets used. And this is not something in our alliance we've actually embraced, largely for Japanese political reasons, but integrated commands, integrated contingency planning, how far are we going to go? So that there's a big piece of homework here once the capability is acquired for the alliance. And I know that not only our civilian policymakers, but our uniform policymakers as well have ideas and are looking forward to that conversation, but find it an important conversation for the alliance a year or two ahead of us. So that's the three documents. On the larger policy agenda, I think we're going to be consumed by Ukraine until that war is over, whether we like it or not. That's not to the exclusion of everything else, but I think the urgency of that alignment, the G7 alignment, and the urgency of what you can see it, you know, with our Secretary of Defense in Germany, right? The provision of tanks, the idea that we have to give Ukraine the capability to win. Victory for Ukraine is increasingly becoming the objective of the parties involved, and that's a high hurdle, as you know. So Ukraine is going to continue to be on the top burner, I think. Whether there's other things for us to think about, that's the reality. And then the second piece, of course, is China, and I hope it's not Taiwan, that it's China that we continue to make a priority in the way that our two governments share analysis, but also coordinate. We've got some, hopefully, high-level symmetry on both of our parts. I haven't heard yet whether or not Foreign Minister Hayashi has set the date for his meeting with China's new foreign minister. I've just been out of touch, so I'm not sure if that's been set yet. But, you know, Secretary Blinken will be going to Beijing, I think, at the end of next week or the beginning of the week after. So we've got things in the works, and I hope Japan does too. That is a parallelism that I'd like us to see continue. There is some talk if all goes well, of Xi possibly coming to the United States, in which case I would like to see Xi also visit Japan. I think that doesn't have to be in lockstep, but we don't want to get out of step in the way that we begin to engage with the Chinese leadership, because I think that would not be wise. Those are the two issues I see is defining our agenda.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. So let me ask one of the questions first. We don't have a name here, but we have seen China's shifting policy from zero COVID to with COVID. And we see many challenges for China from the health side and then the economic weakness. And also we have seen the population has just turned to declining, which is we're seeing aging population in China. So growing concern about Chinese economic weakness and ramifications. What would be the ramifications for the international systems?
So there's so many ramifications that I don't know if I'm the right person to be asking that question of. I think as we look at China as a strategic competitor, we might be tempted to say, oh, that's good. A weaker China is better. But in fact, it's not. I mean, China's size, the size of its economy, will have systemic consequences. So any kind of internally generated difficulties in China, especially if there's sudden difficulties, right, would not be in the interest of the United States or Japan, frankly. It would affect our growth, economic growth. It would affect the stability of the international system. But I don't see sudden, collapse of China kind of scenarios ahead of us. I think China is going to have the Chinese Communist Party is going to have a very hard time. Xi Jinping is going to have a very hard time as he moves forward with regenerating a growth rate that will allow the CCP to manage the kinds of pressures. You mentioned the population pressure, but there are others, right? The balance between urban and rural China is increasingly causing, right, problems. But I think, at the end of the day, I don't worry too much about dramatic changes in China in the economic sphere, but it will be a slow growth China, and it will be a Chinese Communist Party rather that is going to have to find its source of legitimacy in other ways. Now, I think that many people would say, okay, that means that Xi is going to look for wins outside, foreign policy wins. And many people will use that logic to say that's why his legacy is reunification of China, and therefore he's going to act on Taiwan. I think that is probably a linear kind of deterministic kind of view of where Xi is going to find his legacy. And I'm not sure I'm persuaded by it. But I think for us, it provides an opportunity. And this is the opportunity that I hope creative thinkers in Tokyo, as well as in the United States, will take more time to consider. And that is, we don't want Xi's legacy to be the unification of China or the use of force against Taiwan. But we want Xi's legacy necessarily, we want to help him have a legacy. And so what is that legacy? And how can we help him and the Chinese people, to be honest? Because I don't know that it's in anybody's interest to watch China fail. And so therein lies, I think, the opportunity to embrace, not with any Pollyannish or naive sense that China is our friend, but that we want to have stability and a predictable relationship with a country of the scale and power of China. And so I think there is an opportunity here for us to be creative in our diplomacy and our engagement without letting our own strategic interests be compromised.
Great. And also here's one more question. It says, I understand China is a major security threat to Japan as well as the United States. However, we also have the economic interdependence and, mostly strong economic partner for Japan. How should we weigh these conflicting interests?
Yeah. So I think we've all, and I include the Europeans in this one. I think Japan, I would, obviously Australia and others would be involved as well. But the advanced industrial democracies understand that they need to mitigate risk. And the risk is that the way we have interacted with China is no longer in our own interest. And so whether that's the protection of critical technologies or it is ensuring that our supply chain is resilient and not overly dependent on China, there's ways of mitigating that risk, not decoupling. Nobody thinks decoupling is a rational strategy given the extent of our economic interdependence. But I think we can move in the direction of risk mitigation without being too worried that economic interdependence is a problem. It is the same economic interdependence, I think, that will stay Xi's hand, because China is also economically interdependent with us. And so herein lies the balancing act. At what point do we decide that economic interdependence has to be eradicated? Well, I don't think that's a wise strategy. So we can identify places where we want to mitigate risk and call China into account for for technology acquisition, right? For all kinds of behavior that is illegitimate, right? We can call China into account for rules that it must adhere to in terms of international trade. The CPTPP accession conversation is going to be a very interesting opportunity for that. But I don't think we need to go all the way down the path to complete decoupling to make us feel like we are secure, our futures are economically secure. So it's a balance, I think. All of our countries, Japan, obviously, United States, Europe, we are all dependent on China. But I think you're watching, for example, the dependence on Russia in Europe for energy has been rewritten in the course of 1 year because of war. It's a harsh way, right? It's a very harsh way to eradicate economic interdependence. But I don't anticipate that we will see that with our relationship in China, but we do have to modulate the extent to which we are willing to put our economic futures at risk in the way in which we deal with China.
Great. Question from the audience, from Romaine. Thank you for your excellent remarks, Dr. Smith. How do you assess Japan's position toward ASEAN has evolved in recent years, given the rising geopolitical tensions in the region? What to expect ahead, also in terms of joint activities with the U.S. in Southeast Asia?
I think Japan has always been a strong partner of ASEAN. I think at some point Japan stopped paying close attention to what was happening in ASEAN, but I think Japan has re-engaged in a way I think it's very constructive, not only for Japan, but for the ASEAN nations themselves. I think it's particularly interesting for me to watch the way that Japan is engaged with the maritime nations of ASEAN, sort of with the capacity building in law enforcement and in making sure that there is collaboration across the region, not just within ASEAN itself, but among Australia, Japan, and others, and even India. So I think Japan has a pretty substantial role to play in engaging with the ASEAN nations. I don't think that United States and Japan always have to be in the same room at the same time. Clearly, Japan historically has a deeper set of ties there. But I do feel that much of the economic infrastructure building, the kind of imagination of the future needs, infrastructure, energy, digital needs of the region writ large, ASEAN plus, right? Other countries across the Indo-Pacific, Japan has their fingers on the pulse better, I think, than we do, unfortunately. But there's lots of places where the United States and Japan can partner there as well. But I see that as a very positive space for Japan.
Great, and we have many questions here. So, question from Katjada. I would like to ask, from the small and medium states position, parentheses Southeast Asia or African, the rise of China and its economic model become another pathway than the Western model. In your opinion, should Japan and the US concern more in this issue and intervene more in the small and medium states' domestic politics and foreign affairs?
So there you go. Western imperialism, of course, has affected many of the states of Africa, right, in ways that many of the leaders of Africa continue to resent. And there's been some interaction with France and Macron recently, for example, accusing Macron of neocolonialism. So I think there's a legacy there for the Western nations, European in particular, but I don't think the United States is immune. I think that I'm not sure that we should be going toe to toe with China, trying to say that we're better than China in every country of Africa or Asia. Obviously, we can't and we shouldn't, but I do think that we should be straightforward about the ways in which we can provide assistance for infrastructure building, for trade, for development finance. In that sense, yeah, I think we should compete with China. I'm not in the development field myself, so I say this solely as somebody who reads the newspaper, not somebody with detailed knowledge. But often the smaller countries can play the larger countries off of each other to their advantage. But I think we've been a little bit chastened by the Sri Lanka example, by other ways in which the debt that smaller countries have racked up with China has not necessarily been in their interest as well. So I would simply say, yes, we should all be there thinking about how we can provide assistance, opportunity to countries that need it. And we should be careful that the rules of the game, the rules manage or protect the interests of the countries that are borrowing money, are asking for development funding, are creating these trade relationships. There needs to be some fair rules of the game for that competition.
Okay, we have one more question here from Mr. Abe. You noticed relative stability of the Japanese society during the COVID crisis, but stability in a way is akin to stagnation which Japan is suffering economically for decades. I wonder how the US can help Japan to get out of this stagnation, even if Japan may increase defense spending to 2% GDP. If the GDP does not grow, the gap with China would only grow.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So, I don't want to say Japan is perfect, so please don't understand the comment I was making about the COVID response. I know that internally that was not the perception of the Japanese people vis-a-vis their government, but you should have seen what it was like to be here in the United States for some portion of that time. It didn't look all that rosy. So I think we've all struggled, and our democracies have struggled in particular. But I don't think that the polarization that we see in Europe, that you see here in the United States, has afflicted Japanese politics. And I'm happy for that. And that's a little bit what I was praising when I said Japan seemed from a distance to be more stable. The polarization and the division and the divisive politics that I see in Europe and here in the United States, some of that is cyclical in nature. So there are questions being raised about the EU as the post-war experiment. There are questions being raised about identity and race and gender and social norms. There is a re-establishment. It's never been gone in the United States. It's always been a part of our social fabric, but there's been a reassertion of Christian fundamentalism as a source of values, right? Social values. So you see in the United States our debate, the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade. You see questions about educating younger people on sexual orientation, on race, on other kinds of social issues being challenged in some parts of our country. So I think what we're watching, and this is something I'm not sure we are going to be in a position to be helpful to Japan or to Japanese society, but I think all of our democracies will raise cyclically normative assumptions about our social values, the way our society is. I know that you are in Japan in the court system. LGBTQ rights, the same-sex marriage issue now is becoming a topic of social inquiry in Japan, Japanese society. So I think this is what democracies do. And it is not always, it's messy. sometimes, and it can be contentious and inflame opinions at moments of challenge. But this is where we are in our country. And so I'm very hesitant to put the United States in a position of schooling Japan on its democratic practice or its social change. But your social change will, in the end, be reflected in your democracy, whether it's in ways of stable interest articulation through elections, through courts. That's what our democracies are all about. They are not about no change, and by stability, that's not what I meant, but by acknowledging the institutional venues through which social change can happen. And I think, to be honest with you, one of the challenges for Japan is going to be in gender equity. I'm not going to point the OECD number, obviously everybody knows it, but it is a challenge, I think, for Japanese society because of your demographics. It's a challenge for Japanese democracy because 50% of your population doesn't have the voice or doesn't feel like it is a place, your democratic politics are a place where they can raise that voice. And similarly, your younger people feel the same way. So change is coming to Japan. It just may not come in the divisive, partisan, contentious way that we are doing it over here in America. The one thing I will say is when I watch Europe, though, is the revision and reinvigoration of the rightist populist parties has me somewhat worried. And again, largely, whether it's Sweden and Italy of late, or it's France, right? Germany, you now have parties based, anti-immigration parties, which look a lot like, racially organized ideas. But those are the kinds of ideas that have mobilized European politics. I don't think Japan is going to have the same issues on the table. Because of your history, but it is not a foregone conclusion that there are going to be some transformative challenges politically in your body politic in the years to come.
Well, one good change about Japanese society is that now GRIPS has a female president.
Yes.
Hiroko Ota, and she's one of the only 5 female presidents at the national universities in Japan.
Yes, and I congratulate GRIPS because,
right?
yes, excellent. I mean, I think female leadership doesn't necessarily mean good leadership. I mean, please don't misunderstand me, but you need to have role models in positions of authority and power. And whether for us that includes, people, African Americans, our Black Americans, our Hispanic Americans, you're starting to see a change in our electoral politics. You're starting to see it in our government. You're starting to see it in our private sector. It is long overdue for some of us, but that change will happen. And so the adjustments that come as a consequence of that, I think, are only positive. And I think in the Japanese case, your diet needs more women. Your 2021 number is less than 9% or something. It went down. I was like, oh my goodness gracious. So young people need to run for office. Women need to feel like it's a place where they belong. We've just watched New Zealand, a prime minister in New Zealand, who I think was one of the most forward-leaning leaders of our time. In her capacity, she's just stepping down, and I think we need more of that across our democracies.
I cannot agree more with the gender equality issue. So we have one final question from the audience. Mr. Mutsuki Yoshio, would you like to ask a question? You have a raising hand. I just want to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hi.
I'm from Ukrainian National State University, and I'm temporarily evacuated in Japan. So my question is something more about national security rather than economic development of Japan. Vladimir Putin had a strong reason invading into Ukraine. But he doesn't have reason to invade into Japan. Neither does Xi Jinping do it. So the only issues left are Taiwan and the alliance with the United States of America. My question is, are these things enough to raise the budget for military expansion of Japan? Is my question.
Well, honestly, I think the kind of capability Japan will need to defend itself. And I think we ought to remember that it's not just the possibility of a Taiwan Straits crisis, it's also North Korea. There are other sources of tension in the region that could destabilize and potentially affect the Japanese people, right, directly. But I think Japan is not in a position to challenge China militarily. So no, I don't think what you're seeing here is simply a response to the Taiwan scenario, nor do I think it's simply a response to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I think this change in Japanese preferences for investing in military capability has been a long time in the making. And this may be just a little bit because this is what I study. So excuse me if I'm being a little narrow in answering your question, but I wrote a book in 2019 that looked at the post-Cold War adjustment of Japan to a changing military balance, but also geostrategic balance in the region. And I think Japan is not, Japan has taken in some ways the for granted, and I don't mean that as a criticism, but the alliance that the United States would be there to defend Japan. And I think the events of the last decade and a half have shown that even if the United States is still going to be engaged in the defense of Japan and the defense of South Korea, there are spillover effects that will obviously in the end affect Japanese security that Japan needs to prepare for. I can't tell you if 2% of your GDP is the right number. I'm just not in a position to do that. Only the Japanese people and the Japanese leadership can decide that, if that's the right investment. But I do think Japan needs to invest more heavily in capabilities that will allow it to be a little bit more robust, given the strength of its neighbors. The only last point I'd say, Matsuki-san, is that there is reason to ask the questions about, if Japan doesn't invest in its own military strength, will the United States and the American people still be willing to defend Japan? And I think that's an underlying question we don't talk about very much. But I think most of us who look at the alliances in the region, and especially for my case, the US-Japan alliance, we were rattled by the politics in 2016. And rattled, I don't mean that in a Republican Democrat sort of way, but the questions that were raised in the campaign for the presidency openly questioned the value of our post-war alliances and whether or not that's the business of the American people. So there is shift in the body politic in the United States, and I don't know that it's a bad thing. I get much more occasion to talk about the value of these alliances to the American people, to a general audience, not an expert audience, than I have ever in the past. And I think it's good that we talk about it, because we're 3 generations out now from the formation of these alliances. And so rethinking what we need to do together and whether our publics are willing to do that together is not a bad exercise. But I do think the Japanese people have largely seen their neighborhood get worse and be a little bit more anxious about what and if and how the United States might act. So I think it's a reasonable assumption to say that Japan could acquire greater capability. I don't know that there is much difference in the operational ambition of the self-defense force that I read in those documents. It is not as if the SDF now has an offensive doctrine. It is still very much a defensive doctrine. And when and if that changes, then you and I should have a different conversation. But I think Japan is keeping pace with the neighborhood that it's living in. And it'll take time for Japan to accomplish what it set out.
Great, thank you very much. I think you raised so many points that I think Japanese need to think about. and especially, you know, budget and the capability and various aspect of the challenge we face. So thank you very much for your talk today. And thank you very much, Dr. Michishita. I think we had a great time. And I just want to thank all the speaker and the commentator and the audience. Thank you for participating. Thank you for asking questions. And we hope to see you at the next occasion. Thank you very much, Dr. Sheila Smith.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
See you.
Good night from
Good night.
Washington.
Good night, Washington. Thank you very much, all.
Sweet,
Bye-bye.
sweet.
Thank you.
おやすみなさい。
おやすみなさい。
Thank you.